August 1912, Chicago. Booker T. Washington, the most powerful black man in America, is reading off his list of speakers. He skips her name. A heavy-set woman in the third row stands up anyway and starts walking toward the stage. Washington ignores her. Twice, on her third attempt, she stops in the aisle and says it loud enough for the whole hall to hear. Quote, "Surely you are not going to shut the door in my face." Her name was Sarah Breedlove. Within 5 years, she would be richer than most of the men sitting in that room. The question isn't whether she got that stage. It's how a woman born in a sharecropper's cabin, orphaned at 7, and going bald from a scalp disease built the fortune that let her demand it. By the end of this story, you'll know exactly how she built it, door by door, jar by jar, and why historians still argue over the number on her final bank statement. Keep this haul in mind. Chicago, 1912. It comes back at the very end of the story when the man who snubbed her reads her name off the program himself. Rewind to 1867, Delta, Louisiana. Sarah Breedlove is born to parents who had been enslaved until just months earlier. She's orphaned by 7, married at 14 to escape an abusive household, and widowed by 20, left alone, with a 2-year-old daughter named Lelia. By 1890, she's in St. Louis, standing over a washtub 12 hours a day, scrubbing other people's linens for about $1.50, roughly $40 today. And her hair is falling out, in clumps. Harsh soaps, poor diet, and untreated scalp disease, common among black women denied running water and decent hygiene products, had left bald patches across her head. For a laundress with a third-grade education, this wasn't vanity. Hair was how black women in that era signaled respectability at church, at work, in public. Losing it meant losing standing. So around 1903, she started selling hair products door to door for a St. Louis businesswoman named Annie Malone, whose company, Poro, was already making its sales agents rich. Sarah was good at it. Too good, by some accounts. Within 2 years, she had her own formula, a sulfur-based ointment she ladled. Reporters came to her in a dream, saying, quote, "A big black man appeared to me and told me what to mix for my hair." Malone's supporters would later accuse her outright of stealing the formula. Walker denied it for the rest of her life. The two women would compete, sometimes bitterly, until the day they died. In 1905, she moved to Denver with, by her own account, about $1.50 in savings. A year later, she married a newspaper ad salesman named Charles Joseph Walker. She took his initials and rebuilt herself, Madam C.J. Walker, not Sarah. Madam, a title borrowed on purpose from French beauty culture to announce she was not a servant. She was a proprietor, and then she did something almost nobody in her position had done. Here's the part of her story that actually made her rich, not the hair grower itself, but the machine she built around it. Walker recruited thousands of black women as sales agents, trained them at her own Walker schools, dressed them in matching white shirtwaists and black skirts, and paid commission on every jar sold door to door. By the early 1910s, she had an estimated 20,000 agents working across the United States, the Caribbean, and Central America. For many of these women, laundresses, farmhands, domestic workers, this was the first time in their lives they earned money without answering to a white employer. That was the real invention, not a hair product, a ladder in an economy built to deny black women one at all. By 1910, she'd moved the operation to Indianapolis and built a factory, a laboratory, and a beauty school on Indiana Avenue. Local papers reported she was paying one of the largest individual income tax bills in the entire state. Man or woman, black or white, tax officials, by multiple accounts, found that hard to believe. Some reportedly challenged her filings more than once, assuming a clerical error, or worse, fraud. There was no error. In 1917, she went further. She began building a 34-room mansion in Irvington-on-Hudson, New York, right next door to John D. Rockefeller. She called it Villa Lawaro. Her white neighbors circulated a petition asking the governor to halt construction, arguing that a black woman's presence would collapse property values along the river. Want one? The New York paper reportedly ran the story under a headline calling her the wealthy negress. The governor did nothing. The mansion went up anyway. Even some black leaders were uneasy, worried the house made her a target, or made the whole community look reckless with money it hadn't actually earned. Walker's response, recorded by her biographers, was blunt. She said she built it, quote, so that the door might be opened wider for a number of other women. That same year, she gathered 200 of her top agents in Philadelphia for what's believed to be the first national convention of businesswomen in American history. She didn't just award prizes for sales, she gave the largest prizes to the agents who'd done the most for their local communities. Funding scholarships, backing local charities, she was building more than a company. She was building an economy inside an economy. But the pace was killing her. By the spring of 19, years of nonstop travel and public speaking had caught up with her body. She suffered from severe hypertension, what doctors of the era called Bright's disease, and her kidneys were failing. Confined to bed at Villa Lawaro, she kept working. In March, she dictated a telegram donating $5,000 to the NAACP's anti-lynching fund, by some accounts the largest single gift the organization had received from an individual up to that point. Her business manager, Freeman B. Ransom, later recalled her saying, quote, I want to live to help my race. On May 25, 1919, Madam C.J. Walker died at Villa Lawaro. She was 51 years old. So, back to the question, how rich was she really? Her personal estate at death was appraised at just over $600,000, or somewhere around $10 to $12 million today. Her company, counting real estate, formulas, and inventory, was valued above $1 million to tired. Which is where the first self-made female millionaire title comes from. Historians still debate whether that figure was inflated for the press. Nobody debates where she started, $1.50 a day over a wash tub. And that hall in Chicago, the one Booker T. Washington almost closed a door on. In 1913, he invited her back. This time, he read her name off the program himself, and she told the room, quote, I am a woman who came from the cotton fields of the South. I was promoted to the wash tub, then to the cook kitchen, and then I promoted myself into the business of manufacturing hair goods. I have built my own factory on my own ground. Here's what her ledger actually proves. Annie Malone, her old rival, arguably ran the bigger company. More agents, more product, moved. But Malone never rebranded herself, never courted headlines, never built a mansion beside a Rockefeller. Walker understood something. Malone didn't. A fortune nobody can see is a fortune nobody believes in. She spent as much energy building the myth of Madam C.J. Walker as she spent building the company underneath it. One more thing, her biographers note. Her daughter, Alelia Walker, inherited the company and Villa Lawaro and spent part of that fortune bankrolling Harlem's literary scene through the 1920s, hosting Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston in a townhouse she nicknamed Dark Tower. Villa Lawaro itself still stands today, listed on the National Register of Historic Places. That townhouse and the money that built it is where this story picks up next. A fortune spent on poems instead of hair growth.